Yeah, my hope today is to add some depth of understanding to this part of the landscape, the Western Klamath Mountains. It's one of the most complex environments for fire, and thus also floristically, as well as socially. We have three of the largest federally recognized tribes in California, and you know, this history that I'm going to be talking about today is, as you'll see, is, you know, it's my history. It's you know, from the time I was born to now. I've been living this, and as a you know, non-native person living in tribal country, and you know, watching as we've shifted from a you know, a resource extraction paradigm to one of ecosystem management and restoration has been a very fulfilling journey. Xander, for some reason, my slides are not advancing, so I think right off the bat here, I'm going to need to figure out how to troubleshoot this a little bit.
Okay.
Let me see here. It just worked right before we started this whole thing. Let's see. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and then I'm going to start trying to share again, and hopefully that'll work. Let's see. I'm going to try sharing again, and we'll start from the root presentation. So hopefully that'll clue it in. Okay. Can you see this?
Yes, we can see the slide again.
All right. So this is our family portrait from when I was 4 years old. That's me on the right, sitting on my dad's lap. My pop came here to the Salmon River country in 1970 to hunt for Bigfoot, and never left. And he ended up moving into one of the many old miners' cabins that was on the Salmon River at that time, where he met my mom, who came there from San Francisco to a local hippie commune. And so from the beginning, I've been a mix of you know, hillbilly, redneck, and hippie. You know, and here we are right on this cultural fault line between the coast and some of the most left-leaning communities in the United States, and then just to the east, where I went to high school, Scott Valley and Etna, is, you know, some of the far right. And so kind of grown up along that cultural fault line, being able to see you know, the truth and the shared values in both of those communities. And I just want to point out in the bottom right, you can see my pop's left leg is in a cast there, and he's got his remaining logging boot from his recent injury there. The other one they had to cut off. Sitting next to my dad is my brother Tim, who as we grew up, you know, Tim became, you know, one of the preeminent fallers in Northern California. Here he is on the left with his falling partner, Andy Dean, the other part of mad timber falling. You know, and so one of my early memories is watching, you know, them cut off the boot off my brother's broken leg. And he was crying because he didn't want him to cut his white boots that he had just bought, you know. But both my dad and my brother turned to me and said, Will, you should do something else. So I became a fisheries biologist, and in my quest to restore our salmon runs, I realized that ultimately it was how we manage fire on this landscape that was the key to restoring our salmon. And so eventually, over time, I also became a fire ecologist and a prescribed burner by training. I just want to talk a little bit about the Klamath Mountains. This picture that I took about 10 years ago from the top of Salmon Mountain, looking east towards the Trinity Alps, Thompson Peak, tells a really important story. In the foreground, you see on the left, Brewer spruce, which is one of our main high country endemic conifers that's a complete fire avoider. Even low intensity fire will kill it. And here it is rubbing branches. Below the slide is actually touching branches with a knobcone pine, which, you know, requires fire for the seeds to, or the cones to open and to set seed. And so you have these, you know, opposite fire regimes cutting on, you know, knife edge features on ridge lines throughout the Klamath Mountains. In the background, you see, you know, 9,000 foot peaks that hold snow and at one time held glaciers, and are, you know, the reason why we have one of the last wild spring Chinook salmon runs in California, that cold water that gets delivered every year. Unfortunately, those salmon runs are going away because the water no longer makes it to the river. You can see in the middle ground that ridge line that's pretty much contiguous, even age, middle age fir stands. You know, there's about 3 to 4 times the amount of straws drawing that water out of the system. And so, you know, yesterday I was out doing the spring Chinook salmon dives just down in the South Fork from where all that snow you see runs down. And on a run where we'd normally see, you know, 250 adult salmon, you know, 20 plus pounds, we saw 7 fish. And so, you know, here we are on the brink of extinction for our spring Chinook salmon. You know, so part of what led me to fire was, you know, understanding how we got here. And these slides that I offer now are just crumbs that I came across on that journey. You know, one of them is the incredible set of 1944 aerial photos that show the level of change that we've undergone at the landscape scale. And I just use this one because it's an example of how we've seen this shift from, you know, south-facing slopes being relatively open, you know, cleared by frequent fire, north-facing slopes having, you know, large late cereal stands of trees with meadows in between, and trees in the draws. Fire would break on those topographic features and would stop at much smaller sizes. Another crumb, another puzzle piece is you know, our conversion from a landscape shaped by fire to one shaped by the lack of fire. And these are some quotes from a paper by regional forester S.B. Shao in 1920, arguing with the people who were lamenting the recent fire exclusion policy. You know, and so, I mean, you guys can read the quotes there. The second one, you know, now the public, through its manager, the Forest Service, unlike the lumberman, is as vitally interested in the forests of the future as it is in the protection of the present mature stand. And it intends to make sure that the future timber crop, like any other crop, is as heavy or complete as can be secured. In reality, what happened here is exactly that. They succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. We went into one of the wettest centuries in the last 5,000 years, and it was easy to keep fire out. You can see in these photos, these are the 2 photos, this one and the one I'm going to show, that were taken by a botanist named Wieslander, who mapped vegetation communities in this region in the 1930s. And these were 2 pictures he took from Orleans. And you can see in the very bottom of the photo, all of these young Douglas fir coming up in this relatively open hardwood stand with some madrone in the background and a tan oak in the foreground. And the other photo he took was in a white oak stand, where you can see the same thing happening, where in the absence of fire, you know, you have Douglas fir coming up and a pretty thick carpet. These 2 before and after photos, the one on the left, Red Cap Glade, was taken in 1944. This is just west of Orleans, a place where Cuttock elder Laverne Glaze remembered gathering brodia bulbs with her grandma when she was a young girl. And, you know, throughout her life, she watched that glade completely disappear until it was no longer on the landscape. Similarly, looking where Laverne lived at a Sandy Bar Ranch on the right there, just across the river, the Klamath River. If you look at the ridge lines, you can see, you know, the canopy closure is very light. Even in the foreground, you see hardwoods and open areas, you know, cleared by fire and also by settlement. You know, fast forward 100 years, and much of that landscape has converted to even age conifers. Another little puzzle piece is the early mapping efforts by the Forest Service, who was charged with suppressing fires. What they actually did here on the Hoopa Reservation, just to the west of us, was capture some of the nature of the indigenous burning patterns. You can see the fire starts that are penciled in red here. They track along the old trail systems, along ridge lines. And if you look up at those polygons on the upper right today, you know, they track on specific vegetation types that those fires were being lit in a staggered sequence of years to burn into recent black, to maintain those vegetation types for gathering. Now, while we don't have that same information for Karuk Aboriginal Territory, which is just to the east and north of there, you know, what we do have is a very rich ethnographic history, as well as oral tradition and stories that speak of what things were, you know, before you know, settlers came and rearranged. You know, the Klamath Mountains are one of the most rich floristic provinces in the United States and in the world. We have the highest conifer diversity of any place globally. Here in the Klamath Mountains, we're seeing a lot of those high country endemic conifers being taken out by high severity wildfires as we transition from one of the wettest centuries on record to one of the driest. And it's, you know, affecting our rivers, and it's changing the landscape forever. Even when we look into the historic records, the photography, you know, this photo from, I think it was around 1905, of the Cuttock center of the world, Katimin, that pointed mountain on the right above Ishipishi Falls, which is considered the center of the Cuttock world. And this photo's always intrigued me. If you look in the foreground on the front right, you see a white man and his native wife, and in front of that you see a burned out log, like one that they maybe would have planted tobacco in. And you also see, you know, open shrublands and the scars of recent wildfires or prescribed fires. And looking to the background, you can see the village of Katimin. And even then, it was being encroached upon. The meadow systems, the grasslands were being encroached upon. This photo that I just clicked on inset was taken just 20 years earlier. And already there's a noticeable difference. You can see in this photo that just popped up that there's more clearings, there's more open habitat. And so really what we're getting at is that, you know, this landscape that created the biological richness, the number of resources needed to create the cultural items of the Cuttock people has completely changed over the past 150 years, almost to a point where it's unrecognizable if it wasn't for the stories and these crumbs of knowledge that have made it through the genocide that happened here in the gold fields of California. You know, the fire knowledge of Nettie Rubin, you know, who knew what kind of fire the hazel sticks needed to make the best kind of baskets, or the fire knowledge of Sandy Bar Bob, who used a relative of Laverne Glace, who used to burn the hillsides there at Sandy Bar Ranch back in the day, are irreplaceable. And luckily for us, some of that fire knowledge of thousands of years in place is passed on to us today by folks like Bill Tripp, who I know some of you know, with the Kuduk Tribe, who's now the director of the Kuduk Tribe Department of Natural Resources, and who's leading us and helping us to restore the process of fire on this landscape and restore the cultural vitality that you know, is still alive today here on the Klamath River. And so we're still managing and non-tribal people supporting the tribe to manage for huckleberries, for acorns, for basketry materials, you know, for all the things that preserve that culture. From the beginning, the industrial mindset in native country was a severe impact on cultural lifeways. You know, first it was the hydraulic mining that washed away the hillsides and diverted the streams and washed away the village sites. And then that was replaced by the logging industry, which really kicked up in the 50s after they got done logging the coastal redwoods and they moved inland to the giant old growth forests of Doug fir and sugar pine and ponderosa pine. And what we saw was a massive clear-cut conversion of much of the flat ground in this country, of which, you know, arguably there isn't a lot of flat ground in this country. So that still left a lot of wildness. But from the beginning, fire exclusion and timber harvest went hand in hand, you know, and we were treating these mountains that for thousands of years had been managed for a myriad of resources, for a single resource, for timber. And so that's why we approached fire exclusion with a religious zeal. The combination of those things on the Salmon River was very striking. Both of these pictures you see now are post the 1987 wildfires, and a lot of the fire behavior you see is because these areas were helicopter logged. There was no requirements for slash cleanup. And so, and that salvage logging happened after the first major wildfire we had, the Hog Fire in 1977. That photo on the right of Yellow Jacket Ridge is above my house where I grew up on the Salmon River. I interviewed an old native logger who was part of that salvage show up there, and he talked about having to quarter saw 8-foot and bigger DBH sugar pine and Doug fir to be able to fly them off the hillside. And so when that fire ripped through a few years later, it burned so hot that literally about 4 to 6 feet of topsoil just washed off that mountain and decomposed granitics into the river. And all of a sudden there was no more salmon in that stretch of the North Fork of the Salmon River. So this is, you know, a map that was created through the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership process that I think is really another major puzzle piece. It's understanding, you know, what kind of fire deficit we're looking at right now. And you can see here, this is the number of fire overlaps on our landscape, and that purple color is no fire in the past 100 years since records were kept, all the way up to that blue color where we've had up to 5 fire overlaps. But like fire ecologist Carl Skinner has said, you know, there's never been any time since the last ice age we've seen this little fire on this landscape. And theoretically, you know, if we hadn't chosen fire exclusion, this map would look so incredibly different. You know, there would be 15 to 30 fire overlaps as an average across much of this landscape. And fires, the average fire size would be much smaller. What we're seeing now is a disturbing trend for much larger size and more high severity fires, just in between, the fires previous to 2013, 2014, and post 2013, 2014. We've seen a jump from about, on average, 15% high severity fire up to about 30% high severity fire, which you can see in these gray and black shaded areas in the 2014 fire footprint maps. And just an example of, a fire deficit turning into a fire glut. Nearly half of the Salmon River watershed has experienced wildfire in the last decade. And a large part of that is because this is country. It's just really hard to stop a wildfire. And also, we're seeing wildfire effects that are different than we've ever seen before. Example of that is the run that the Whites Fire made in 2014 up Tanner's Peak. Created a pyrocumulonimbus cloud that spread lightning 70 miles north into Oregon, and started several other large-scale wildfires that year, notably several right around the town of Happy Camp that turned into the Happy Camp complex, which got up to 130,000 acres by the end of the year. So if we look into why those fires started, it's really tied to the fire deficit. The Tanner's Peak, the area that spawned that pyrocumulonimbus cloud, hadn't burned in over 100 years in a place that was highly fire dependent. And so that's really what we're seeing, is these places where, we've taken fire out of the system and they've grown up in an even age first and are at a very high rate getting turned to matchsticks across the landscape, with fairly devastating effects on the fishery and communities. This is just one example of Grider Creek, a watershed that was burned in 2014 and experienced a midsummer thunderstorm in 2015, July of 2015. And in an afternoon, 20 miles of high quality coho habitat, which are one of our threatened salmon species, was completely decimated, in the short term anyways. I mean, as a fisheries biologist, you look at this and you see, a reconnected floodplain and maybe potential for future habitat. But the reality is, when we're down to 5% of the historic numbers, these types of events are very catastrophic. And the difference between what's going on private lands versus public lands. This is a good example across the Klamath from Grider Creek up Beaver Creek, where there's checkerboard ownership. There's a lot of clear cutting going on the burn in the private lands, and lesser amount in the foreground, which is Forest Service lands. But still, creeks like Beaver Creek that were historically major salmon streams are barely producing salmon anymore. So I say we're currently maximizing fires, the negative impacts of fire in the Klamath Mountains. We put out all the fires that would have more beneficial effects, and the few that do escape suppression do so because they start at the hottest, driest times of the year. And so that's a greater proportion of high intensity fire and more risk to communities and firefighters. The reality is that, as far as forestry in the Klamath Mountains, at least from the Salmon River example, about 70% of the plantations from that 30 to 40 years of logging have burned up or experienced wildfire of some sort, before reaching a harvestable age. So I realize I've focused a lot on the history, but I think it's critical to where we are now. You know, we started with the Fire Safe Council in 2001 to address this issue and to make a table for the tribe and the Forest Service and other partners to come together and figure out how we were going to restore fire on this landscape. Unfortunately, our first collaborative effort ended up in a road blockade when the tribe, stopped the loggers from after they had, cut a bunch of trees along a ceremonial trail that had been agreed to in our collaborative effort that weren't going to be cut. And then so we started looking at what went wrong, and part of that was, the definition of collaboration. With that first collaboration on the Orleans Community Fuels Reduction Project, the Forest Service pre-decided the footprint. And then even though prescribed burning was very important to the rest of the partners, that somehow got dropped from the NEPA. And so we weren't able to go back in and burn those areas after the thinning had occurred. And then, right away, the agreements that we made in the partnership didn't make it into the stand cards. And then we had, violations of the NEPA on top of that, that caused that project to end in a hard way. And so, luckily, because of support from the Nature Conservancy and other groups, we were able to get some high-level facilitation to come back to the table, and try to re-envision what collaboration looked like. And that process that we started in 2013 became the Western Klamath Restoration Partnership. We collaboratively identified our planning area, which is about 1.2 million acres in the Western Klamath Mountains. And you can see it's primarily a national forest ownership. However, about 84% of that landscape was Karuk Aboriginal territory. Even though there were treaties written with the Karuk, none of them were ratified by the United States. And so tribal folks were relegated to allotments, and it was converted to national forest. One of the keys to the success of WKRP, which came from my growing up, was rallying around shared values. This also is a cornerstone of the open standards process, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But our focus on sustainable local economies, cultural and community vitality, fire adapted communities, restored fire regimes, resilient biodiverse forest plants, animals, and fish, and a healthy river system. These were things that the pastor from Happy Camp and the ex-log truck driver who was a tribal member, and the environmental representatives and other folks could all get behind. And coming together around what we could agree to and not what we disagreed on was key to our early success. Also looking at holistic fire management, how all the pieces fit together. Too often we look at it through one lens, but only when we look at the social, cultural, ecological, and economic aspects of fire can we see what needs to happen. So WKRP over the past 6+ years has been building support at all levels for upslope restoration actions, starting from the local all the way to the national. And a huge piece of that was using a collaborative process through the open standards process for conservation that really centered true collaboration. Whereas, nobody loses an arm or a leg at the end of the day. At the end of the day, if any one partner says no, we're not going to do that thing. And that's what builds trust with all of us. I think one of the other early successes was that we didn't just talk about things that were going to happen in the future. We started doing in the present. We organized prescribed fire training exchanges, and we started burning together. And that gave us, that excitement, that thing to rally around for us to see change on the ground. And we really invested heavily in workforce development. And so in a short amount of time, we went from, tribal blockades of Forest Service projects to ribbon cutting events like the one that happened at the beginning of a recent NIFWIF funded fuels reduction project, to go back into that OCFR project and do what the Forest Service originally said they were going to do. Another example was, bringing our community to get together and educating ourselves about the role of wildfire on this landscape. In 2017, we had two wildfires, the Island and the Wallow fires that burned in the Marble Mountain Wilderness area. Now, the first one, the Island fire, the Forest Service supervisor, Patty Grantham, chose to manage it as a managed wildfire because we had several pre-season fire meetings with those very communities talking about where they would be willing to see fires managed for resource objectives. And luckily, because the Forest Service made that choice, when later in the fire season, another lightning bust started the Wallow fire just to the east. And everybody agreed it was a full suppression fire as it marched east towards Etna and the towns in Scott Valley. When we had a 50-mile-an-hour wind event that then drove it back to the west, it ran smack into that Island fire footprint. And you can see on this IR map the little dots out to the left around Chimney Rock. Well, if that Island fire hadn't been there to stop the Wallow fire run, the glow that I saw in the high country that morning when I looked to the east wouldn't have been a glow in the high country. That fire would have been in my backyard. I just want to briefly touch about our industry involvement, because I know there are some industry folks on the call today. Because of that unsuccessful OCFR effort, industry was in attendance for, they were very skeptical about getting involved in WKRP. But the WKRP leadership reached out to those folks and brought them in ahead of time and listened to what their needs were. And really what they said was, hey, what we need for industry is a dependable supply of wood from NFS. It's not like we're asking for this huge amount. We just want to know what it is. And we want to engage, when the projects are ready to hit the ground. And so that's, pretty much how it's been going. We've had intermittent visits from our regional mills and industry folks, when projects are getting close to development, or when we get to a point where we need their engagement. A big piece of WKRP is creating zones of agreement, things that we all agree need to have done or want to see done. And for a lot of that is, implementing stuff that was identified in our community wildfire protection plans, to wildlife habitat, to thinning these mid-mature dense fir stands where it makes sense ecologically. And then what we're able to do is overlay all of those different values onto a map and create this, prioritization for our 1.2 million acre landscape that factored in these shared values. And so people could see their values were part of our prioritization process, and that allowed us to keep that momentum and not have people feel like that, their ideas were being left off the table. And I strongly encourage folks looking at this paper we did with the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network that described this process. I don't really have time today to go into it. And I realize it's 12:42, I'm getting near on time, so I'll speed up here a little bit. With the SOMAS project, we brought that agreement in practice, or in principle, down to agreement in practice. the SOMES project was the first pilot project of WKRP, and it was aimed at restoring fire process after a century of fire exclusion in our most high risk mid-slope private inholdings on the west side of the Marble Mountains. One of the first successes was pre-treating the private lands as much as the private landowners were willing, and the Forest Service helped us to get NEPA for those private lands. One of the really cool things about the SOMES project, and I encourage folks to look at that environmental assessment, all 395 pages of it, was that we fully analyzed the no action alternative and looked at the reality of what doing nothing meant on that landscape. We also used traditional knowledge as a form of best available science, including moving away from single species management. And we collaboratively developed prescriptions. We had interagency field crews. All of our forestry, archaeology, botany, and fire crews had members of the tribe, NGOs, and the Forest Service working together. And we're really aimed at restoring a process, the process of fire on this landscape. I think I'm going to skip some of these slides because I want to leave time for questions. And I think I've talked about a lot of the rationale and principles. I did want to go through some of the commercial thinning prescriptions because I thought folks would be interested in that. We used ICO forestry techniques, looking at trees of interest in the natural stands, and then also creating openings and retention areas. And then we did a food grove assessment with the tribe to understand where folks where tribal folks were interested in creating food groves. And then of course, adhering to the NSO guidelines. One of the big things was that we all decided not to have set diameter limits. Because we could see on the ground that, when you have a 32-inch DBH Doug fir that's 60 years old and it's starting to overtop a 300-year-old black oak, it's clear what we need to do. One of the other things that was interesting about that project was using focal species, to start to broaden our view about how these animals and meeting their needs overlapped throughout the project. We also created a tiered set of agreements, starting with a master stewardship agreement between the Karuk tribe and the Six Rivers National Forest, and then a supplemental project agreement specific to the SOMES project with Mikwik, the Karuk tribe, the Forest Service, as well as Lomakatsi Restoration Project that had 10 plus years of experience with these stewardship projects in Region 6 and Region 5 to help guide us through and mentor our local folks. And we also, I just want to mention with the prescribed fire training exchanges, TNC was able to step in and make an MOU with Region 5 that would allow us to burn across public-private boundaries during those trainings. Another huge step was the Karuk tribe deciding to host other NGOs, fire positions, qualifications in the IQCS. So I realize I'm at 12:46. Dang it, Xander, I should have timed this more directly when I was going through it. So I think I have quite a few more slides here, so I'm going to go more quickly. And folks on the phone, just feel free to reach out if anything spoke to you directly, if you want to hear more about it. I was just going to briefly cover some of the other cool stuff that we're engaged in, including, nearly 20 years of burning together, where we've really made some progress with a lot of the obstacles that have blocked prescribed burning. Yeah, Xander, do you want to say anything right now? I realize it's 12:47 and we wanted to leave time for questions, and I still have quite a few more slides.
No, I think keep going. We're getting some good stuff in the chat, sharing some resources. So why don't you forge ahead and we'll we'll deal with questions as we can.
Copy that. Thanks. Yeah, just, an example from last year's Klamath Treks. We worked with CAL FIRE to get one of the largest CEQA documents, CEs in history done right before the event. We had 106 participants from locally, nationally, and internationally show up and have 70 training assignments. Incredible amount of training happening at these events, and a huge media presence to be able to tell that story and spread it far and wide. Got 25 separate burn units done in a period when most of the state of California all of the state of California was in a statewide burn suspension. So this just speaks to this ongoing relationship with our state fire managers and our federal fire managers who've learned to trust us, to do what we say we're going to do and to put good fire on the ground when the land is telling us it needs to be there, and I think really, this key that, you have to build that bridge of shared vision between your local, tribal, state, and federal resources for things to move. And to engage these national networks like, the Forest Stewards Guild, the Fire Adapted Communities, Fire Learning Networks, Firewise. These are all great programs to engage with. And don't be afraid of burning around people's homes. I think that's people seeing fire is a huge piece of success in the long run. And how many people get touched by good fire, because so many people have been touched by bad fire. I know some people disagree with those terms, but it's true. The folks that come out of these Trex events have a new understanding of what good fire looks like on the landscape. Just one example of us, doing what we, folks thought could never be done. We burned this 60-acre unit that Sandy Bar Bob probably burned 100 plus years ago. It's a 90% slope. This is the one in one of those before and after historical photos. A 90% slope with over 20 homes directly below. We were setting loose boulders that were rolling down the hill and ended up on the county road right there. But we were, over the course of 2 days, we were able to bring fire back to this landscape that hadn't burned in over 100 years. With no pre-treatment except for the fire lines, and have less than 5% canopy mortality. Another key to getting social license is to allow people to see, what the smoke effects from prescribed fires actually are compared to wildfires. And this is just tying back to that Wallow fire in 2017 compared to that 2017 Trex. And the amount of smoke, for a very tiny amount of time, a couple hours, we got into unhealthy. But for the most part, we were able to manage that smoke impact. Part of our future is engaging all models of getting good fire on the ground, from, the cultural burning and the Trex model, to interagency mobile burn teams, like's been happening in New Mexico with the all hands, all lands model that the Forest Stewards Guild has been pioneering, to prescribed burn associations and engaging the large landowners, especially the ranching community, to start to create space for managing wildfires for resource objectives. Now, this is just a recent example from where I live at Butler Flat on the Salmon River, where I look to those recent wildfire footprints as my fire resilience, and Trex, having the prescribed burns right around our private property makes us feel better about wanting those areas to burn again before they go too long without fire. Another example is the work to create these potential operational wildfire delineations on our landscape, and to have the communities and the other stakeholders agree to where those places are that we want to invest in managing wildfire from, and also hopefully someday in igniting prescribed fire, large scale prescribed fires from. And so this is very germane to what's going on with CAL FIRE and the California Forest Management Task Force, wanting areas like the North Coast Resource Partnership to prioritize where to put funding into these landscape scale strategies. And this is just a little example of how those pods are created, through first looking at potential control lines, and then suppression difficulty, as well as, qualitative risk assessment, which then spits out, where areas are that, full suppression is key, or we can manage wildfire. Also one of the most exciting things we're working on right now is state and transition models in partnership with Paul Hesberg with the Pacific Northwest Research Station and Susan Pritchard at the University of Washington, following up on work they did up in Idaho and Washington. Basically creating these models that showed what fire would do on a landscape and the vegetation that they could create. If you were engaging in a full suppression model or a no suppression model, and what we're trying to do here on the Klamaths is a cultural fire model. How can humans, because humans are responsible for fire in our landscapes, how can humans manage wildfire on this landscape for the diversity, the ecosystem diversity that we want and need? And that ties to understanding what those pre-suppression conditions were, and also whether or not the treatments that we're proposing today are going to have the effects we think they are, or whether we need to shift those treatments to have the effect that we want. It also helps model carbon sequestration at a landscape scale, and many other benefits. And this is just an example of, where the models that they created really point towards a lot of the cultural information about how these forests were. That little box on the upper right, borrowed from the Anderson and Barber paper, is from the work that Hesberg and Pritchard did. It really synced up with that cultural knowledge. I'm really stoked. We, WKRP, submitted a collaborative forest landscape restoration program proposal, and the rankings just came out, and we were recommended for funding in 2021. And I think this level of collaboration, where everybody comes to the table and everything is on the table, is key. And a big question is, how are you going to pay for all this work that doesn't pay for itself? And I just want to tell people, that money's there. If you go all in with collaboration, you can find funding to do the treatments that aren't necessarily, paying for themselves, but need to get done to balance the impacts that we've had in the past. So, finally, what we're looking at now, in the background, that mountain you see, Off-Field Mountain, was ceremonially burned every year at the end of the Kudu World Renewal ceremonies in the middle of September. And that ceremony, while many others have been brought back, like the jump dance, the mountain dance that happens in the foreground there at Ikes Falls, that ceremony on Off-Field Mountain hasn't been brought back because laws prohibit the tribe from burning the mountain, obviously. And so our next project with the Six Rivers National Forest is to create enabling conditions to do the work on the ground, to make the space for those ceremonies to come back. And really, it's an incredible project. One of the focal species for that project are humans. And we're looking at how restoring fire process on that landscape affects humans as a species, and thus ties us to our responsibility, as well as to our ability to, manage landscapes for all living things. So we're also looking at, implementing the burning portion of the SOMES project on 5,000 acres. We're currently implementing the mechanical thinning part of that project right now. And we're looking at lines on the ground where we're going to manage wildfires too. And from that point, we're going to use prescribed fire into the communities. And we're also looking at, bringing fire back to these recent wildfire footprints. Just to circle back to my brother, a lot of the trees he's cutting this day and age are in the 4-inch class instead of the 4 to 8 feet DBH class. This is him, working with our Fire Safe Council doing thinning around the community. The fact that we were able to forgive our differences after not talking to each other for 3 years and come back together and work together is powerful testament to the work that can be done when we open our minds to other people's perspectives. I did just want to briefly touch on these 2 principles from the FSC guidelines for certification that directly tie to this landscape, and I hope folks will reference that when thinking about doing work in the Klamath Mountains and elsewhere. With that, I'll end and open it up for questions.
Thank you so much, Will. I really appreciate you taking us all the way through that. I think it really highlights, obviously, there are a number of things you just kind of touched on that you could have spent an hour on. And I think that's actually useful because it highlights the complexity of the region, of the culture, of the management challenges. So I think we can impose upon Will to stick around at least a few minutes. So if you have a burning question, you can unmute yourself, and we only have about 22 people on the line. So you can unmute yourself and speak up or type it into the chat window. And maybe while we're waiting, one thing you mentioned an ICO approach to thinning, I believe, Will, and I just wasn't familiar with that acronym.
Yeah, individuals, clumps, and openings.
Okay, related to northern spotted owl?
It's not just related to northern spotted owl. It's related to creating habitat heterogeneity with the focus on thinning around trees of interest. Especially in a fire excluded landscape where you've got trees that are legacy trees that are still hanging on but need some help to stay on the landscape.
Great, and Dr. Lake actually just put a reference in the chat window for that approach, so that's really helpful. Other folks have questions or comments or insights?
Hey, Will, this is Neil Chapman in Flagstaff. Did you run into anything where maybe your agency Sylvies or just their prescriptions sort of butted up against some of the traditional ideals of what the forest should look like structurally, or do those things align quite easily for you guys?
No, I mean it's people who come out of traditional forestry institutions, definitely have a hard time wrapping their head around managing for these multiple objectives that folks like Dr. Frank Lake can really give voice to. I mean, one of my aha moments happened when on a previous project we were out with Laverne Glaze, the elder I spoke of, and we're talking about what to do with the 34 to 40 inch Doug firs on that unit, and she brought it back to, hey, well, this is the place where I used to gather huckleberries as a child. And I could care less about what's going on with these trees. I want to see sunlight hit the grounds, so that these huckleberries can come back and we can gather in this place. So, specific to the SOMES project, I would say, there was a lot of issues around like how much thinning to do in one project. And I think a lot of, the foresters were wanting to open up stands more in that single entry than other folks were comfortable with. And so I think we kind of made we found a place to meet in the middle when we're out marking.
Right on, thanks.
Other questions or comments out there? Okay, I hate to cut off conversation because I think there's certainly it'd be fun to have a whole, sit around and chat in person about all this. It's really fascinating to me. But I think that we can wrap it up here. And Will, I just want to thank you again. Excellent presentation. I think the storytelling with the underlying foundation of the science was really effective. So I appreciate it. And thanks to everybody participating. I know some people had to drop off because of the top of the hour, but I really appreciate everyone being on. And we're hoping to have one or two more webinars from other folks with some expertise in the Klamath-Siskiyou region. So if you didn't get this announcement directly from the Guild, make sure you're on our email list, and you can always send your name to me directly and I can help you get on there. I'm Xander at forestguild.org. So with that, thanks so much, and I'll be emailing the recording to everybody, and I look forward to other ways we can interact. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Xander.
Thank you so much.